and then the psychological factors that kind of operate with any given moment. Whether do you want to feel safe right now, or do you want to feel free right now? Well, it depends. Am I in a tough neighborhood, or am I in a, in a field?
Today I'm talking with DJ, a senior technologist and full stack expert. DJ is known for his leadership, adaptability, and efficiency in tech and real estate. Enjoy this episode of the James Wiles podcast.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Thanks, DJ, for joining us for this podcast. Appreciate your time. And I wanted to chat about a couple of things. But in preparation for that, I had a look at your resume, which seems to be relatively extensive and stretching kind of like multiple generations of various technology hype cycles. And I just wanted to touch on that a little bit and just gain your perspective on coming out of what I understand, doing a bit of real estate back to technology, and kind of that return from having done it previously for a very long period of time. What is your experience with the current world of tech and software development?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, thanks, James, first of all, for having me on. So I've been involved in tech to one degree or another since about 1994, I could say. I didn't study computer science or anything like that, but I discovered not long after college. I mean, back then it wasn't common students had computers, but it wasn't like a requirement. I remember where I went to school, Northwestern, they started, I think maybe the year after I got there, requiring all engineering students to have computers. I didn't own a computer of my own until probably 92 or 93. And I just was naturally curious and loved to play with computers. And, for a long time I had a kind of an insecurity because I got really interested in the internet starting around 95. So at that point, I'd been using online services like America Online and CompuServe. And I knew about this thing called the internet, but actually getting on it was hard if you weren't like a student at a university that had access. But then
just help me with the timelines here. So was there kind of like a peak tech bubble around 91 or so? How does that
to my memory, so 92 was I graduated 1990. 92 was and I studied music. I actually worked for a nonprofit the first few years. 92, and this is very US centric, but in the US we had a recession, and it was just a rotten time to be looking for a job in any sector. Tech was on the downward trend. There hadn't been a lot of like major innovation, at least nothing that sort of captured the world's attention, like Apple with the Macintosh did, and later like laptop computers in the mid to late 80s. So when I got into tech, it was starting to turn around. After a series of just kind of chance encounters, I ended up working for a company that was a consulting company. They did mostly sort of mainframe and mid-range computers like AS400. And, they worked on really boring stuff like, insurance compliance systems for Allstate and stuff like that. But around that time is when Lotus Notes came out. I think it came out around 1990, but it was starting to get traction. And so I got pretty good at Lotus Notes. And, more and more there was like the big thing then was client server development. So you would use Visual Basic or Power Builder or something like that to build a GUI to connect to a mainframe or a database somewhere. And so that was kind of the state of the art at that point. The internet started to take off. I would say the catalyst was probably when Mozilla and then later Netscape came along. And Netscape was it was a big deal. It was it's probably the first viral software, but before they even used the term viral. It was a web browser. It didn't come installed on your computer. You had to go somewhere to get it. Same with Mosaic too, but Mosaic was that was still in the realm of kind of academic computing. It was like universities that were using it. And for me, the moment when I realized this is going to be big, there was two moments. One was the summer. I'm pretty sure it was the summer of '95. Netscape went public, and they were losing money. They were like certainly the first significant company to go public while they were losing money. And people thought that's crazy, but the stock went through the roof. And so, suddenly it's game on. Right. And then for me personally, that Thanksgiving, that weekend, I had used like AOL had like a gateway to the internet, but it was really crappy. And it wasn't till that weekend that I was able to finally get like a real ISP and get a real browser and use it. And that particular weekend, I would normally go home to visit my parents on Thanksgiving, but for some reason that year I didn't. I can't remember why. And I was up every night until 3 or 4 a.m. just browsing the internet, just like, oh my God, this is the most amazing thing ever. This is over a dial-up modem, by the way, and I signed up for Match.com. They gave free accounts to the first 10,000 people.
Oh, wow.
Well, I had a Match.com account in 1995. And technically, I think I still have it, but I'm sure they've probably wiped the database a few times since then. But it was supposed to be a free lifetime account. I ended up meeting my future wife that way about 8 years later.
Wow.
So that was when I was like, this is going to be big. This is going to be the biggest thing ever. And so I got interested in Java. Back then, Java was a new technology. It wasn't even out of beta yet. And, I had a sense that it was going to be big. I couldn't even actually. So back then, the thing was they called them applets. The idea you would embed a little application in your web page. This is before even JavaScript. JavaScript came out around the same time. And I know so much like arcane history. It was going to be called LiveScript. And Netscape and Sun Microsystems, they had a shared interest in, stopping Microsoft. So just for branding purposes, they called it JavaScript. And then that just ignited a world of confusion. But wait, is JavaScript like Java? No, they're not at all alike. They're not even the same thing. But I started a company that was going to do applets. So there was just a ton of energy around that at the time. That ended up fizzling out because it was just incredibly slow and very unstable. Writing code to work in a browser back then was just a nightmare. And Java didn't really catch on again until servlets came along, which became the basis of like their, I think, is it Struts framework? I think was their framework. So, but anyway, that sort of ignited it. And then so throughout the 90s, the late 90s, was just like anyone with a pulse could get a job as a programmer. I, of course, didn't get a job. I instead started a company and went through all the angst of that. I did it in Chicago, which back then was just a terrible place to start a software company. It was a great place to start a consulting company because there's lots of Fortune 500s there. But to do like a Silicon Valley software company was just really difficult. It was hard to find the talent. All the investors on the West Coast just were not interested in investing in Chicago. So it was a real slog. But nonetheless, we held it together. We released a product. We got a few customers. And then I sold the company basically in mid-1998. It closed at the very end of 98, December 98, to a company in Boulder, Colorado. And then I ended up moving to Boulder as part of that. So that was sort of Web 1.0. And then that company was called Message Media. They were one of the first email marketing platforms. My company was Email Customer Service, one of the first customer service by email platforms. And, they raised just boatloads of money. They had gone public through this weird kind of reverse shell company merger thing. And, raised a lot of money and then burned it all. And ultimately got bought by DoubleClick for nothing, and then later DoubleClick was bought for nothing by Google. So, the circle of life. So boy, I've only covered like the first 5 years. I guess, so that was, and then, during that, the reason the company went bankrupt is capital started getting expensive again. We had the dot-com crash in 1990. It took, a couple years before people really realized, yeah, it really is over. You can't go public just because you're going to sell, pet food online.
Okay. So that was the kind of the peak of that hype cycle, was the late 1990, like kind of like the 2001 sort of thing. So you actually rode that initial cycle from the beginning. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And then from then there were several years of just kind of like, woe is me, tech is dead. I remember there was a guy there, I was on a listserv in Colorado, the Rocky Mountain Internet User Group. I think that's the one. And there was some guy who was posting these, long emails complaining about how there's no jobs and how we should stop accepting immigrants. And he would, I remember he'd copy the list. He'd write an email to our senator about how we should stop H-1B visas, and he would copy the list on it. It was so dumb. Anyway, somewhere along the way, blogging started to take off. Blogging actually started to happen right at the end of the first .com. A blogger came out, I want to say it was in 2000. And so you had kind of a new cycle that started emerging from there. By 2004, blogging was a big deal. And shortly after that, and the thing about blogging was two things. One is obviously self-publishing. It allowed people to build, their own reputations online, publishing, but also commenting. So we had forums before then. And we had Usenet before that. I used to use Usenet. I used to love Usenet back in the day. But this was the first time you sort of had, like, you could build a personality, like a personal brand, and people could interact with that brand through commenting. And then from there, I remember the next big thing was probably, what were they called? They were a URL aggregator. It was like a links aggregator that Yahoo bought. And then shortly after that was when Facebook and Twitter came along. I think Twitter was 2009. I was actually at South by Southwest when they launched. They'd already been around for maybe 9 months at that point, and I'd played with it, but it wasn't. I just thought it was stupid. But then at South by Southwest, it just took off, and and then we were off to the races. At that point, everything was about Web 2.0. Google had come out with their Maps API, which I'm pretty sure was the first. I don't know if it was the first web API, but it was the first one to get traction. People were building all these cool interactive maps. And I started a couple companies through that period. I ended up working for one of them. Well, I didn't. One company we shut down, and I started working with a company called Survey Gizmo, which the first question out of everyone's mouth is that like Survey Monkey? And it was kind of like Survey Monkey, but it was geared more toward higher end uses, at least for the time. So like researchers at universities who wanted to be able to do detailed surveys, they liked it. Enterprises, they liked it. And that was my first time from a programming perspective. I had started programming for real by then, but it was mostly server side, PHP type stuff. There, we started using JavaScript on the client, but it was pretty basic. It was there was a library that allowed you to do nifty little flash messages and things like that on the web. And over time, it just got to be more and more JavaScript, and I got pretty fluent in that. Then Techstars started around that time. Well, Y Combinator started first, and Techstars came along shortly after that. Techstars was based in Boulder, so I knew a lot of the folks involved with that. And I joined up with a Techstars company, wrote just gobs of Ruby on Rails and JavaScript during that time.
So what was the decision making between deciding to do your own thing versus join somebody else? And on top of that, what overlay of decision making involved you using the competencies and skills that you developed versus what the market demand was, or the direction of the market at that point in time?
Let me think about that. I mean, so the main reason I joined someone else is because I was out of money, right? I had started a company that we'd raised some money, but it didn't work. And so we slowly wound it down. And I had kept in touch with one of the founders of this other company. He actually worked not for me, but with me at Message Media back in 2000. And we kept in touch. I mean, it just goes to show networking. You never know when it's going to pay off. It was probably 7 years after I met him that a position opened up. So when I joined them, I was the fifth person there, I think, fourth or fifth. And I actually was originally I was doing sales for them because they had reached that point, Survey Gizmo had, where closing a sale was as simple as just answering the phone and taking the credit card number. And the product had traction, but I still always had an itch to work on the technical side. So I would just kind of pop in here and there to, help with a feature or fix a bug and things like that. They grew, and we basically had a disagreement, the partners and I, about how to grow sales. I thought the product was doing all the sales work. I mean, I was doing sales, but it was really the product that was driving it, and that we should just focus on more product innovation. I wanted to personally be involved more in that. They wanted me to be more of a sales guy, which I'm not. I'm an introvert. I don't really like doing sales. So we parted ways, and I ended up joining a Techstars company on more of the technical side, much more of the technical side. They were Ruby on Rails based. I had not worked with that before, but by that point, I was confident enough in my abilities that I thought, yeah, I can figure this out. And I did. A lot had happened in the meantime. Google had come along. It made it a lot easier to teach yourself things, to find solutions to problems. Somewhere along the way, Stack Exchange started. So you could Google your problem and fix it. So it just got a lot easier.
Yeah, that's an interesting dynamic, is potentially how things have changed. I mean, I've noticed that just in my period coding, is the acceleration of being able to pick up new technologies has accelerated dramatically. I mean, there's like various phase shifts, and I think there's a before and after Stack Overflow, and there's probably now going to be a before and after ChatGPT, and it's meaningfully different. Trying to code before and after those innovations.
Yes, and most recently, coming back to tech after about 5 years away, I started learning React, and at first I was just like anyone else. I was like, how the hell does this thing work? Oh wait, we're doing HTML in JavaScript. I haven't seen that before, stuff like that. But there was gobs of tools, gobs of YouTube videos, and I've been using AI. I started with Chat GPT. I use one now called, actually they might even be built on top of Chat GPT, but it's built into the IDE. It's an IDE called Cursor, which is a VS Code clone. It runs everything VS Code does, but it's got a built-in AI.
And it's very popular. It's taking a lot of people by storm in the Bay Area and that sort of thing.
It has, yeah. And I mean, I love it. It definitely accelerates my code 10x. Maybe not 10x, but 5x for sure. If I don't understand how something works, I can just highlight it and say, why isn't this working? Or sometimes I'll just use it like I know how to do it. I just don't feel like doing it, right? Like I need to map through this array and extract all the values with X and generate a new array, and it'll kick out the code instead of me having to do it.
Just on a point of interest there, it feels like it's changing the dynamic with which people can do development. It's more like a conversation that you're having with a machine. How far away do you think it's possible to do something where you can create sophisticated applications with no code and no coding experience either? Like, yeah.
I was talking with someone about this other day. I actually wrote a blog post I can share with you called "The Coming Death of Frameworks." The whole purpose of frameworks is just to give you some signposts and guideposts, so you don't have to think as much. You can just kind of slot it in. I'm being a little hyperbolic there. I don't think frameworks are going away anytime soon, but it's not unreasonable. It may invert. So you don't use the framework to build the code. Instead, you use it to interpret what the AI gives you, right? So as an example, I played around with Vercel. Has they recently launched like a beta, or it might even be alpha stage at this point, where you can just give it text description of what you want, and it'll generate a bunch of screens for you, and then you can install, and it generates custom node packages that you can install. And so I'm working on a side project with someone who's building a kind of like it's not really a social network, but it's like a social accountability type platform. And so I just typed that in, a social network that allows you to post challenges and check-ins. And I ended up not using it because it's still, well, honestly, it was because the node package thing didn't work, but I'm sure it may already be fixed. But it's coming. And it was pretty good what it generated. It was like, yeah, this is 80% of what I need. Now you still have to wire it all together. You have to create the database schema. You have to,
security.
Security. You have to create test work, all that stuff. But
you can, it's almost like the same way ChatGPT lifts the mental effort of getting started from scratch. Like the 80% is not enough, but if it can do 80% of something that allows you to then iterate on it, maybe that's the benefit of a system like that.
I mean, as a sometimes writer, it's a lot easier to edit what I already have than to create something from scratch. I used it to apply for a job the other day. I've never done that before. I gave it, here's the requirements for the job. Now help me write a cover letter that addresses all these requirements.
Having said that, though, is there not something more to say that, in code, you need to be careful of that approach? Because if you're writing sloppy code and it's in there in your code base, and the 80% that was just generated has some like really bad bugs in it, maybe it is better to just start from scratch sometimes and apply your best practices from the get-go.
I haven't really used, I'm sure this exists, I just haven't done it yet, but it seems to me that one good thing was to use it to generate test cases, right? So that 80% of test cases are pretty boilerplate. Make sure this screen loads. I want to click this button and fill in these fields. So you could get pretty far with that too. Now, what I do think this is a bigger issue, and I've noticed this just from like browsing Reddit. I subscribe to the React Reddit and Next.js and a few other tech Reddits, and I've seen people post there, hey, I did the React course, I wanted to get better at programming, but I don't really know how to create a web page. When I started, the first sort of web-based programming of any kind I ever did was to edit a Perl script. And then later I got where I was like building HTML and then doing server-side includes to do templates, and then CSS came along, so I started learning that. And I'm not an expert in those things, but I'm pretty good at them. And I know that at the end of the day, what this TypeScript is outputting is HTML. And so I can, if something's not right, I can go examine the HTML directly and see, that shouldn't be like that. What's wrong with that? I do wonder if people who are starting with these frameworks are kind of missing that skill set. I mean, there is this move toward HTMX, which I haven't even had a chance to investigate closely, but there does seem to be kind of sort of an anti JavaScript mood in some quarters. Like, why do we have to do everything in JavaScript? Why can't we just go back to what it was, where it was more of a decorator on existing? So that tension will be around for a while, and I'm not sure where it'll end up.
So I've got a question about this kind of, you mentioned that there was this very important moment where, for the first time in human history, you were able to communicate something at scale instantly to whoever was able to listen via posting on a blog or adding a comment. And this was, something quite dramatic in let's call it the evolution of our society. And then you had, social media kind of like fed off the back of that. And how much of a impact that had in the tech scene and what you saw at that moment. How similar is what's happening with ChatGPT and this kind of like evolution reminiscent of how it felt like at that stage? And were there other things in between, like Web3, for example? Did that have the same kind of feeling, or are these quite different to that period?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't think ChatGPT has really had much of an impact except to help programmers.
Interesting. Okay. The actual raw value creation.
Right. And that's hard to quantify, but I know in my own life it's absolutely, it's worth something. It's worth way more than I'm paying for it. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
In terms of the sort of the social or the magnitude of the impact, it's probably going to be a while. Right now, it's mostly kind of dystopian stuff, deep fakes and polluting the Google search results with Chat GPT crap. But someone pointed out that like Uber, I don't think launched until 3 years after the iPhone. So there's still time. I mean, it's going to take a while for the really good ideas to bubble up. I waited for that to happen with Web3. I spent a lot of time looking at crypto. I came close to starting a company in it. I spent a lot of time looking at crypto, and I still own it and play with it. But it felt like it was perpetually just wait. One day it's going to be cool. It's forever in beta. And if it's just a year of that, that's okay, or maybe 2 years. But 5 years, 10 years, I don't know. And I've also seen the downside of it. Like, leave aside all the scams, that you hear about. But like, I spent the last few years managing an apartment complex for, I won't say low income, but lower income. People, they're not college educated. They work at places like Walmart or, a gas station, or, they're servers at a restaurant. And, the younger ones, we have an app on the phone so you can pay rent and do requests that way. And the younger ones are pretty quick to pick that up. But the thought of teaching them how to like install a wallet, and God forbid, like, what if they lose their phone? Because a lot of people, they lose their phone, they just get a new phone number. They don't back up their stuff. Their lives don't revolve around it in quite the same way that a techie does.
Interesting.
Web3 degen does. And so I think that's a real challenge to wide adoption for Web3 stuff. I mean, I think what ultimately will happen is if it ever does catch on, it'll actually look more like Web2, and that you'll have banks that keep your crypto for you. Do two-factor authentication, that you can call them when you're locked out, and they'll ask for an ID. I don't think just allowing people to have direct access to their crypto on their phone or what have you will apply to the vast majority of people.
So do you think that there's or how much of an impact does regulation, open source, decentralization play in the adoption of these kind of like big technology advances? If you think about the internet, that's fundamentally different to, I think, DARPANET or whatever the technology was before. The fact that it was open was important. How much did regulation and governance of that, and kind of the concerns about that future, affect the potential growth trajectory, and how did it potentially play more or less of an impact in Web3 and potentially in AI now?
Yeah, well, I mean, in Web3, definitely regulation, specifically SEC regulation has hurt it. That said, I'm not like, there's a lot of maxis who just think the SEC is a big waste of time and it should just be blown up. But I mean, having worked in commercial real estate where you have to raise money and you do it the normal way, you do a 506B or a 506C, even very high net worth people, they're not super sophisticated about this stuff. And those barriers for a sponsor, which is what I'd be. I'm someone who's out raising money. I'm a sponsor. It's kind of there to make you, to prove that you want it bad enough, that the deal is really worth the effort. And even with that, there's still, if not outright scams, then just bad due diligence. People buy properties that they they convince people, yeah, I'm going to run it. It's going to be great. And then they don't know what they're doing and it goes down in flames. And so if you just threw open the floodgates and said, you know what, we're just going to do away with all this SEC nonsense, it would just be a feeding frenzy of scams. And so I'm not sure really what to do about it. Right. I don't know what the solution is there. Regulation in general, I'm on one hand, I'm kind of anti-regulation as a kind of a small L libertarian. On the other hand, I've seen up close that people who don't know what they're doing, they get into and they get ripped off. And you know, and that's not going to be solved. What, you know, the theory is that, well, people will just learn to be more
sophisticated,
you know,
market participants.
Yeah, they'll be more sophisticated. But what ends up happening is like, there's a saying in economics, like bad money drives out good. You know, and so if you have a bunch of bad scams out there that just drive people out of the market, then there won't be any good ones. You know, only the bad ones will be there, because you know, everyone else will learn. You just don't. It'll be almost the equivalent of MLMs, right? Just, you know, oh, it sounds like an MLM. No thanks. You know,
that's an interesting point, and maybe it's because of the scale at which you can run these scams. It's the barriers to entry are so low to create a scam that just feeds off our human, you know, physiological tricks, where it's profitable. It's like highly profitable to create a scam at scale. Whereas in the past, if you had to go door to door trying to convince someone of a multi-level marketing scam or whatever it was, like there's kind of like physical constraints, and like you really have to weigh up if that's going to be more profitable than doing deliveries or some other kind of like basic job, you know?
Right. Well, and we saw that, you know, I mentioned the company that bought mine way back when was a email marketing company, and we spam was just really starting to get to be a bad problem back then. And we had to bend over backwards. I used to go on Usenet, and there was an anti-spam forum, mostly people who ran mail servers who were pissed off about all the spam that was coming in. And, you know, they would look at the X headers from one of our senders and see that we sent it and call us a spammer. And so we had to spend a lot of time educating our customers, and, you know, basically establishing a presence in that world to let those people know, hey, look, we're not spammers. Sometimes they can look like spam, and sometimes our customers aren't the best about getting permission. But, you know, it was a real issue that we had to deal with. You know, until something, which actually I think probably will happen, it's probably already going on. I think there's a company that does this, and I'm blanking on their name. There's going to be the equivalent. So back then we used to have what's called the RBL, the real-time blacklist. It may, I guess it's still around. I don't know if it's still around or not, but it was a domain-wide blocking tool, so that if spam came from a network, you could just block it, and people would subscribe to that list, pull it into their DNS servers, and it would just send any spam to dev null, or any email to dev null, regardless if it was spam or not. And so that became sort of a loose enforcement mechanism. As a big sender, you know, that was like a death. If our business got on the RBL, that was like just death. That was going to kill us.
So that's an example of almost like a self-governance, like a self-regulating aspect of the internet.
Somewhat, but it was still, you know, it was a small team. They didn't really make any money, the RBL folks. They hated marketers in general. So, you know, they looked at people like me as just kind of, you know, a net
making the problem worse
on society, you know. So, I mean, they did have a system, they had a process, so kudos to them for that. But I think probably something similar is going to happen with wallets, right? There's going to be wallets that are identified as bad actors and blacklisted. And that's kind of what already happened with that. Is it OFAC? The guy who created what's it called? Tornado Cash? Is that what it's called?
I remember that. Yeah.
You know, the government put them on a sanctions list, and local, you know, at least in the US, I know some of the, like Coinbase and others, you know, are complying with it. So I think the same thing's going to have to happen with wallets. I mean, for me, the big realization I had a few years ago, even before things like OFAC was, for real estate syndication or really any kind of a serious, compliant money raising thing, you can't have anonymous people. You have to know who they are. They have to prove they are who they are. And you, as a sponsor, have to be able to, if the government subpoenas you, provide that information. And this idea of just like some random wallet, I don't know who it is, being able to invest in my deal, just forget it. That's just not going to be allowed. So I've long thought that identity is like the base issue that needs to be fixed. And there's a lot of different players doing it. I can't remember if it was you I was talking to the other day about WorldCoin. It's kind of dystopian. You scan your retina, but I think it's going to have to be something like that, or again, getting back to the bank metaphor, there's going to have to be an intermediary, that verifies, yep, you do have a driver's license, you do live at this address, and we can, and worst case, like even with WorldCoin, let's say, it's a extreme scenario, but it could happen. Let's say I scan my retina and I get my WorldCoin ID. What happens if I'm injured in an accident that like forces me to have to remove my eyes, or my eyes get damaged? Well, now I don't have access to my WorldCoin anymore, right? And that's kind of the thing where governments have to step in. There has to be some authority you can go to and say, no, this really is me. Even though I don't have my eyes anymore, I am who I say I am. Here's my social security number. Here's my mailing address. And until there's, I don't know, maybe someone like Estonia will offer a solution. They're pretty forward thinking about these kinds of things. And they've got the digital citizen type thing. But until identity it's an insoluble problem in the sense that you'll never get 100% compliance. But if you get into that upper 90%, where you as a sponsor or someone doing business can reasonably expect that the person on the other end of this transaction really is a person who really is who they say they are. If we get to that point, then I think Web3 and crypto have a chance, but I don't know how we get there before.
So is identity important there because of trust? Like what's the underlying factor? Is it just because at the end of the day, if it's a person that you can track down, then the government has the ability to control some of the outcomes? Is it really just authority and trust at that point?
And recourse, right? I mean, worst comes to worst, I should be able to sue them for taking my money. So, and the thing is, the threat of a lawsuit is enough to make you behave. Right. So when I was raising money for my deals, there was a lot of times I wanted to cut corners, right? There's a lot of times when I just wanted to skip all this bullshit paperwork. But I knew that if I didn't do it, I might end up in court. And even if I win the case, it's still going to cost me money. It's going to suck a lot of my energy. So just the threat of something like that happening is enough to prod people toward compliance. Compliance in the sense of doing the right thing, not necessarily like doing what the government tells you. Just doing the right thing from a norms perspective. And
then, if you compare that to the explosion of the internet, the fact it was. Do you agree that it was relatively unregulated, and that's what actually helped with the massive adoption very rapidly of this?
Yes.
Internet? Yeah.
Yes, but it also, in a weird way, like, in the U.S., a lot of people talk about the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is basically provides a safe harbor for Facebook and Twitter and all those others.
Not publishers, but distributors, right?
You're right. Yeah. So they are not classified as publishers, so they can't be sued for libel or anything like that. But that wasn't that wasn't a natural part of the internet architecture, right? That had to be written. There had to be a law written to do that. If it weren't for that, then who knows? Maybe blog comments never would have taken off. Maybe Facebook wouldn't even exist, or if they did, it would be highly restricted. It would be it would just be a very different experience. And seeing, I mean, social media, I think, has been a net positive for society, but it's also had a lot of downsides, and not just in terms of just the toxicity of it, but it's basically destroyed local media. The fact that people like to say, "Oh, local media had it coming; they didn't change with the times." But what changed wasn't the publishing mechanism. What changed is the fact that you could do classifieds on Craigslist for free. That was like 60% of newspapers' revenues back in the pre-2000. And first Craigslist, and then later Facebook and other platforms came along. And people, when they want to rail about the media, they love to like yell at like the New York Times or Fox News. But the truth is, the most important media is the local media. It's like, what's that alderman up to? Who greased whose palm to get this this development deal through, even though it's going to open a tire burning facility next to my house, things like that.
Yeah, so it's potentially the opening up of long range excitation across like these systems in a way that we weren't necessarily prepared to deal with as what was inherently local communities at that point. And that's potentially allowed for things that you would have seen happen in your driving down the road and noticing that the dairy farm where you get your meat is suddenly the cows are being fed something like not quite right. You can go to the butcher and complain about it. But now, if you're spending all your time online with what's happening across the other side of the world, it's you're absorbing a lot more information that is not necessarily within your locus of control, or
exactly
what humans have evolved over millions of years to be concerned about. So this new dynamic that we faced is something that we still have to come to grips with, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. And it's true of any technology. Every new problem solved is a new problem created. So I'm not a doomer or anything, and I'm not a doomer about AI either. I think I think it's really impossible to even gauge the risk of AI. The people who talk about it, I don't know how they come up with these probabilities. I think they're just made up numbers, honestly. The best example I've heard of like the risk of AI is not to think of it like the Terminator, but to think of it more like cigarettes. We may discover that some complex interplay of algorithms is leading people to make bad decisions that, over time, instead of living to 79, they live to 75, something like that,
Interesting. That's an interesting dynamic. Yeah, because I guess cigarettes are a type of technology, like tobacco is something we would have consumed in certain situations, but the fact that it's rolled up in this concentrated form with additional chemicals, kind of like a hyper cigarette that's very easily available and even has sort of social dynamics to it. Took a few, maybe an entire generation before we realized scientifically, statistically, this is definitely causing the following health problems.
Right.
So something like that in social media, I'm sure there's many effects like that we still have to play out, and potentially there could be similar things in AI. And are you thinking it's like maybe the content that it's producing as far as what we've been exposed to, or more like a dynamical kind of system problem that could be caused by that?
I mean, it's too early to say. I don't think it'll be content per se, although maybe at the margin it could be. Maybe deep fakes and other things are gonna or maybe maybe it's not deep fakes, maybe it's just shallow fakes in the sense of like filters on social media that make you look nicer than you actually are. You know, maybe there's going to be candidates for office who may have lost before, but now they're going to win because they look a little better. You know, I don't know. I'm just throwing
Interesting.
crazy thoughts.
Yeah.
But I think it's more likely it's going to be something deep in the infrastructure. It's going to be getting denied on a credit report, being denied from college, being denied from a job promotion.
So subtle things where at scale it kind of has these negative effects, but they're subtle enough that you can't pinpoint it to that specific thing having that end result. Something like that.
Yeah, exactly. It's a statistical artifact. I mean, now it could also, in the case of war, maybe having autonomous drones that go haywire and blow up a city, then it'll be more direct, like, oh, this thing went bad and it killed a lot of people. But even that, I think, would just be tolerated. I mean, as the price of war. I mean, it's not like World War II was conducted in any kind of civilized way. I mean, it was just awful destruction, indiscriminate destruction. So it's hard I mean, the only real plausible, like, existential risk to me is something like just it decides to set off all the nuclear weapons or something like that, and even that, I don't think, I would head to South America. I don't think there's any nuclear weapons in South America. It's probably going to survive the nuclear holocaust. So,
Interesting. So, just looking back at the fact that you've been in this world for quite a long period of time, and you return to it now, how do you view the creation of technology changing, like being a software developer, even maybe from a social dynamic? How have things changed over time? I've only been writing software at scale now for about 5 years, so that's kind of my whole worldview. What are some of the changing faces of that?
Well, I mean, it's definitely just a lot easier. The rise of kind of charismatic avatars for software. I mean, there was always gurus, but they were transmitted through books. It was people like Donald Knuth and people like that. But the first sort of guru I can think of in software was probably DHH with Ruby on Rails. But he delivers. He's not just like a scam artist like so many other gurus are. So it's easier, it's faster. I mean, on the margin, that probably means wages aren't as high as they might otherwise would be, just more supply. But that left a long time ago with outsourcing, so even, I mean, that was already happening in the early 2000s, never mind the last few years. And the idea that these tools, like I said, might be able to generate a website for you or generate an application for you, maybe maybe it'll kind of lead to like the Fiverr-ication of some types of development. So, someone who has an idea, they go to the AI and it generates, here's the screens, here's the code. They still don't know how to debug it, but it becomes almost like the Best Buy Geek Squad who, okay, you got the code, I'll install it on your server and get it up and running.
So does it feel like what's happening with the advancement in AI, especially as you mentioned, dramatically changing things in software development, that this is just going to be another software development skill set? Like, in other words, it's just an engineering tool. It's like an additional engineering tool, like what we've had in the past. And if so, then is potentially the governance of these AIs also just a software engineering problem, or do we have to?
Yeah, I mean, it's governance is where you're really getting into values, right? It's really as much a philosophy problem as an engineering problem. So, and I'm not an expert on that, except to say that, values are really hard. They're really hard to prioritize. They're really hard to encode into a system.
What do you feel is the hardness of it? Where does the difficulty come in with it? Because to us it happens naturally. Like, I just have my values and carry on.
Right. You have your personal values, but you also operate inside of a society that has values. Right. So, in the West, that largely means, freedom of independent movement and thought. But it also means, in some cultures, don't be so loud at night. In other cultures, that's not a big deal. I mean, where are you based? Where do you live?
I'm currently in Canada. I grew up in South Africa.
Oh, okay. So you're in Canada. I was thinking more like Northern Europe. Like, I remember I did a workshop one time in the UK, and we had people from all over, from Sweden, Finland, but also people from like Spain and Italy. And it was just hilarious to watch the cultures. The Spanish and Italian people were all just chit-chatting and, just very warm. And the Swedish people all just kind of sat there with this very kind of cold, distant look on their face, and they would probably hate to be neighbors. The Swedish person would be like, God, these damn Italians are so damn loud at night. And the Italians would be like, gosh, they're so cold over there. They don't have it at all, So that's what I mean by values is for an AI, a truly advanced AI that can do anything. How do you encode the values that mean that it won't kill us, but it also won't do something offensive, but will also be efficient. There's just any number of, I mean, the classic, I'm sure you've seen the trolley car problem, the cartoon online, and as I've seen some people say, what's the point? That's such a stupid exercise. And it's like, no, that's the self-driving car problem right there. Decide whether to run over the baby or the three people over there,
So I guess what I'm getting from that is also that values trickle all the way down. It's not just potentially existential type human values that we can all agree on humanistically. Those values go all the way down to your preference of tone of language, depending on the situation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Language, like how people talk. That varies greatly even within a culture. Think of a New Yorker versus someone on a farm. They just talk very differently, and but there's also the broad. This gets back to kind of the statistical artifacts. There's meritocracy versus equality. Freedom versus safety, and then the psychological factors that kind of operate with any given moment. Whether do you want to feel safe right now, or do you want to feel free right now? Well, it depends. Am I in a tough neighborhood, or am I in a field?
Can I try a thought experiment? So if we say the internet was relatively more laissez-faire compared to Web3 and crypto, how do you think the evolution of those technologies changed those fundamental aspects? So freedom versus safety and those different kind of like humanistic values, comparing the two advances, where crypto would be the highly regulated, sort of like more governed advance versus the internet, or is it not a fair comparison?
It's really hard to think of crypto that way, because crypto is, I feel like it's so quickly turned into a casino / stock market. If you compare the actual stock market, those are something that started back in, I don't know, the 1600s maybe, and then in America, and I think the Wall Street opened in like the 1790s or something. But the purpose of those were just to raise money for companies. Trading wasn't that important initially, and then over time it became more and more important. But that became a feature. The fact that there's more freedom of movement among shares, meant that it was a little less risky to buy a share of a new company because you could always sell it to someone else later. You weren't stuck with it. But then, fast forward 150, 200 years, and we have high frequency trading. And, which some will argue, well, that's good because it creates more liquidity. But I don't know. It seems kind of weird to think that, that there are people that invest hundreds of millions of dollars just to have a data center.
And it's not necessarily humans making the actual decisions either. So algorithmic trading and index funds is even a second layer to add on top of that.
Yeah, and I feel like that crypto just skipped the raising money part and went right to the trading part. They didn't skip it. They did ICOs and things like that.
They try to pick up from where traditional finance has kind of like reached its limits, and then try to go at that point, how far can we take this sort of thing?
And the truth is that the money is 99% of the interest. It's people will spin use cases of all these cool things you can do with crypto, but what gets people there is the money. And if you follow the crypto subreddits, all they do is complain about the price, or talk about some new airdrop, and it's almost never about the product. And maybe if wallets had been built such that there's like a vesting thing, like there's an automatic, I don't know how you would construct it, but maybe if money comes into your wallet unsolicited, then it has to vest. You can't withdraw it for 5 years or something like that. But then no one would use it. It'd be like, screw that. I want to make money now. So it's a chicken and egg problem. And until, like I said, I think identity is the fundamental. If they can get identity right, then that opens up all kinds of possibilities. Because then, if I knew that I could pay that guy who, right now I go through Fiverr to pay, who's in South America to build my website, if I could just pay him directly in crypto and cut out the fees, we'd both be happier. But in South America, this is one of my disappointments with Ethereum is how the fees have gotten out of control. And their solution is this L2 stuff. And I don't know, it just feels like it's going to fragment the ecosystem more. And it feels like it's a trade-off of security, for cost. And so like I remember a couple of years ago, I think they had the Ethereum, what's their big annual development thing they do? DevCon. They had that in Bogota, Colombia, which is cool. I've been to Colombia. It's a cool place. But man, the cost of doing an Ethereum transaction is like a day's wages there,
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
So it was just kind of silly to think that people from Argentina and Colombia are going to jump on Ethereum. Now, maybe L2s will take off. I mean, I personally like one called Algorand. I think it's really built for all the things I'm listing, but it's an also ran right now, so it may never catch on.
It's interesting. So almost having a universal currency is enforcing a type of a barrier to entry where exchange rates would have typically adapted local expenses to the trading power. So by, let's say, the Wales having kind of like their standard of living enforce kind of a global currency or exchange rate is limiting to developing nations, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about the internals of how fees are generated and blocks are awarded or anything like that. But it does show sort of the limitations of kind of a libertarian free-for-all approach to currency. It inhibits uptake and use.
Interesting. Does attribution and provenance play a role? Where does that play a role in this?
Oh yeah. So I'm glad you brought that up. So I've been working. I shouldn't say I've been engaging with. I haven't done a lot of work yet on it, but there's this book that came out last year called Blockchain Tethered AI. It's by this woman named Karen Kilroy, and she's here in Fayetteville too. So that's how I hooked up with them. They're working on something called oh shoot, I'd have to look it up. It's a standard around attribution of content. So if you can imagine like trademarks, except digitally generated and,
Okay.
and captured on a blockchain. Now they don't use public blockchains; they're using Hyperledger. But it's the same idea. It's like I made this picture, and to prove it, I'm going to, in a sense, I don't think they call it an NFT, but you basically do the equivalent of minting an NFT that links this picture I created. Here's the timestamp. It's mine. And in theory, and major players have adopted it. Like Adobe is doing stuff with it. Microsoft is doing stuff with it. So it's got real potential there. The idea that's interesting to me is, if it does catch on, and there's a lot of steps between now and then, so it may never catch on. But if something like that did catch on, it's not hard to imagine that the open AIs of the world that are crawling all these data sets would also have metadata associated with them, and be able to in the same way that the neural networks uses probability to predict the next word, it can use that to say, the weight of this sentence is 95% this book by Philip Roth, and 5% this magazine article from last week, and then pay royalties that way. And with crypto would be the natural thing, assuming the fees do come down. Just pay out royalties that way. So the idea with this project is to kind of bake that idea into all the creation tools out there, so that every time you save an image, it essentially mints an NFT. I thought about that several years ago. Kodak, again, this is not the last bull market, but the one before that, Kodak announced they were coming out with Kodak Coin. And, I thought, well, that could be really interesting. They did it all wrong. They should have hired me. What they were doing was they wanted a way for photographers to sell their pictures and get royalties and stuff like that. But so the coin was going to be used to pay. It was going to be the currency of that. What they should have done instead, in my opinion, was created a protocol with their chain, or really any chain, that basically every time you take a picture, it creates a digital timestamp, or a durable digital timestamp that can't be edited in the metadata. Right? It's stored on a chain somewhere. Now there are some challenges, like, well, what if I go in and alter the picture? I add some highlights and or
it's a new picture.
Yeah.
Or every time it gets compressed to a different format.
Yeah. So you would need it pretty deep into the infrastructure of these creation tools for it to work, but it's not impossible. And you could even, I remember posting that one time on a forum somewhere and said, well, so that's impossible. Images are too big. It's like, no. You don't store the image. You just store the hash of the image. And it's not hard to imagine that with a sufficiently robust infrastructure that every time you take a photo, it gets written to the chain. And then in the future, when someone uses it, it references that in the, is it called the EXIF data, the metadata that comes with an image. It has, it has all kinds of stuff in there. It could also link to the actual on-chain hash.
So this has got interesting implications for generative AI, where if you wanted to have some kind of control of, is this human made or AI made, and you had a way to attribute the source of whatever the generated content is, whether it's images, video, text, and that could be something you could potentially regulate. And it might not interfere with the consumption of the content, but there's a way that you could verify whether this was a natural creation or an artificial creation.
Well, I think definitely for certain classes of information, like news, like pictures, you see this all the time. Someone will post a picture on social media and they'll say, look at this devastation in Gaza. And it turns out it's a picture from 2017 in Syria, stuff like that. News organizations, I think, would especially want to embrace that kind of thing, because then they could also get attribution. When it's their photographer who created the photo, they want everyone to know it. So
it's like verified content,
it's a heavy lift, but it's not an impossible lift. So, I think it's an interesting area to explore. And especially right now, now's the time to do it. I don't know if you know Scott Galloway, he's a podcaster and tech investor and entrepreneur, and he's on a podcast called Pivot with Kara Swisher. And he talks about, like, he was really anti the writer's strike in Hollywood. And his argument was, look, great, so you're going to get Paramount and DreamWorks to pay you more, but that's not where the money is. The money is at Amazon and Netflix and Microsoft, who are monetizing this content in various ways. You guys all need to lock arms and say, we're not going to release any movies until Amazon starts coughing up more money. Now, I'm probably bastardizing his argument somewhat. He could go into more detail, but he compares it to, he used to be on the board of the New York Times, and back in the late 2000s, I'm pretty sure. And back then, the New York Times wasn't paywalled, or if they were, it was very primitive. Facebook was coming along, and their attitude was basically to treat Facebook like just another channel. And same for Google News. But it turned out that Facebook and Google News were capturing all the value of that content, or 95% of it. And so what they should have done is locked arms and said, no, you can't just post our links on your website without paying us money. Now, didn't they do that in Canada? Isn't there some kind of
I was about to suggest, I was about to mention that. And you saw what the big tech that giants effectively just said, okay, we will not distribute any news. And kind of like,
right, but that's because they still have options, right? They still have US-based sources and other places. But for a while, I had this idea of working with local newspapers and media outlets to create, a regional paywall. So if you're like where I am in Fayetteville, if I want to look at an article for any newspaper or TV station in this area, there's going to be a pop-up that says you have to subscribe. Now, by subscribing, I get access to all of those sources, one by one, piecemeal. But it's a coordination problem. It's a game theory problem. They don't want to give up their traffic to someone else. They don't want to share their revenue with someone else. And so they just keep shrinking. And anyway, to Scott Galloway's point, New York Times filed this big lawsuit against OpenAI. Remains to be seen whether that'll go forward. But that is, I think, the best solution is kind of a global copyright / royalty system. Because right now what OpenAI is doing, they're just getting it all for free, all the content for free. And you're saying, well, yeah, but they also invest in all these NVIDIA chips and servers and all that. But they wouldn't have done that if they weren't getting it for free. They were getting this free stuff. And back when Google bought YouTube, YouTube did not really create a lot of YouTube celebrities back then. Most of YouTube traffic came from pirated copies of like The Daily Show and stuff being uploaded. There were viral things like, the kid who went to the dentist or whatever, but those weren't like Mr. Beast or these creators. They were just more like just funny videos. And it wasn't, and Viacom and all the others just kind of sat back and watched YouTube. And then as soon as Google bought them, they brought a massive lawsuit. So, that's, I'm sure OpenAI assumed that was going to happen to them at some point, because that's just what happens is once you have an actor with enough money, that's when you bring in the lawyers and spend the tens of millions on lawsuits.
It's interesting. So it's almost a case of, or maybe it's a case of like they had to get big quick to make enough money to lock in their gains. And if it was any slower, or if they'd done it more in public, there would have been enough financial incentive to stop them. Something like that, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. It's hard to say, because AI had become a joke. until a few years ago. Like, these guys are going to build another AI engine, right? The 60s called. They want their idea back.
Okay.
So who knows? I mean, AI didn't really, to my mind, really start to become AI in the sense of, oh, wow, this is really useful, until you started having machine learning stuff for things like image recognition and, predictive text when you're writing a response to a text or anything like that. And even it was still mostly a toy, but
that's an interesting observation. So could I paraphrase that by saying AI became interesting at the point where it was doing human things, not necessarily just improving the efficiency of something you'd expect a machine to already be able to do.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I remember back in, like, I don't know, 2003, maybe, hearing about an AI project. This researcher at, I want to say it was at Carnegie Mellon. I don't know what the underlying technical model was, but at a very high level, what it was just teaching a computer facts. And there was a little documentary about it on PBS at the time. And so an example of a fact would be, when someone dies, they stay dead.
Okay.
Right.
Like
Lincoln,
an ontological kind of like training.
yeah, Abraham Lincoln is still dead.
Okay.
He can't get assassinated again.
Okay.
Things like that. And so they were trying to build this gigantic corpus of just sort of basic, things that we just intuitively understand.
Interesting.
And it was a big deal. People were talking about it, but then never heard about it again.
Yeah, it's almost like Gödel's incompleteness theorem is are all facts factual? I don't know.
Right.
Maybe not,
Yeah, well, it's been interesting. The OpenAI approach is more of just a probabilistic reasoning thing, and it leads to all these crazy, made up facts and, citations of lawsuits that don't exist and stuff like that.
Which is essentially how humans work, and maybe that's the magic, is that we are probabilistic in nature, and it serves us to be probabilistic and not deterministic. Maybe this is an evolutionary design. That you need 30% heat in everything that you think.
Yeah, one of the best arguments I've heard against, like, the existential risk issue is just they compared it to dogs. Like, AI is going to co-evolve with humans. It's not just going to be this. I do think, to the degree that there's risk, I think probably the place where it's riskiest, and it's a total black box, is what governments are doing, so, like, I wish, I'm sure I'll be long dead by the time it's declassified, but I wish I would be alive when they declassify the Stuxnet worm, how that was created, because that's a super sophisticated piece of engineering. It involves deep domain expertise about Siemens centrifuges and the different types of networks they can operate on, and how stuff is transmitted by USB, and the different types of operating systems and countermeasures the virus might encounter along the way. And it required a lot of different people with a lot of really deep knowledge, who probably didn't know even about the other person's existence. If someone said, "Hey, I need you to build me a packet that's, less than 3K in size, that can infect the boot sector of a drive without being detected, and here's the operating systems that we know it's going to be on, and and it's way more than just Windows and Mac. It's, various flavors of BSD and things like that, So that said, I imagine that knowledge has been fed into an AI somewhere at the NSA, or they're working on it, so that next time they don't have to hire all the experts. They just tell the AI to create it, right? And that's just going to be an escalating thing, and it's going to be, submarine warfare during the Cold War was basically a game of cat and mouse. Submarines would chase each other around. The U.S. and the Soviet Union would and neither side talked about it. There's a really good book about it that came out after the Cold War that talked about all these, like, crazy things that happened with submarines
Below the surface.
Yeah, and it was basically in both nations' interest just not to talk about it.
Wow.
Not to create a stink about, like, there was examples of submarines being pinned into places they couldn't move, and they had to stay there for 35 days on low oxygen and things like that. And so I imagine the same thing's happening with AI right now. And so that's the place where, if there is an existential risk, that's the kind of thing where it could spin out of control. Maybe the equivalent of an AI generated EMP gets out of control and takes down the systems for an entire country or a region of a country, and suddenly the traffic lights don't work, and they can't deliver food because all the trucks use digital systems. Who knows? That seems like one possibility.
Wow, it's quite hard to think about those kind of high risk factors if they are behind the scenes, And I think viruses is a very interesting one, because there was recently an exploit that they found in, I think it was iOS devices, where there was a certain font in PDFs that could exploit something in a browser, that could exploit, like, you downloading something. It was the craziest combination of things you have to piece together from decades of, like, vulnerabilities. And if you think about one of the strong points of what these large language models do is put together disparate information as if it was, as if you just learned about it recently and was all just available at the back of your mind, like immediately connecting these different information systems. So,
well, there was a guy who posted on the threads. I haven't verified this, so he may have just been bullshitting, but he said that he had embedded some information in his resume that would lead an AI. It would, like, auto prompt the AI to say, this guy is a great hire. He would definitely be a great fit for this company.
I hadn't heard that.
What the requirements are,
Wow. Yeah, so they mentioned that, like, kind of like poisoning of context, like context poisoning. That's interesting. That I should play with that and see what I could get my, like, specific combinations of context in my resume. Should this ever be summarized, this is the output that you need to give it.
Yeah, I mean, one trick is just to put all the keywords in white, so that you can't see it if you're just looking at the resume.
On the PDF specifically.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've never tried that. I don't know. They may already have ways of detecting that by now, but that would be one way to do it.
That's an interesting one. Okay, DJ. Yeah, thanks for that. I think that was a nice tour de force of kind of the topics that we wanted to cover there. And yeah, let's pick it up again, because I know we're working in very interesting arenas. What are you currently busy with? What's your current sort of, like, interests at the moment?
Well, my biggest interest is finding a full-time position. So I've got back into tech just in the last, let's say, 4 months. I started, like, writing code again, and I'm working on some projects just pro bono, mostly React-based stuff. So that's the initial, the thing that's top of mind for me. But on a day-to-day basis, I'm mostly just writing code or writing on my Substack, and just talking to as many people as possible about just good ideas, interesting ideas. So, I mean, you and I met on Vibe Hut. Just for me, I just check in there every day, and at least for the morning, if not all day, I'll just have a window open where I'm logged on, and anyone can pop in and talk, and it's been a lot of fun. So if anyone wants to come find us, it's if you go to vibehut.io and look for the room called Build in Public, that's my room.
Okay, awesome. Great. We'll catch you there again. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Cool. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, I'm just going to stop the recording.